Welcome to Scala Foundation's webinar, Art is a Jealous God, the Necessity of Beauty for Human Happiness. My name is Margarita Mooney, and I am the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation. I'm also a professor of practical theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. And I'm delighted to have with us today our guest, James Matthew Wilson, a philosopher, a poet, and much more. Before I introduce our guest, let me welcome you all today. We are expecting a very large audience of hundreds of people in the United States as well as abroad. I'm always curious who's here, and I can see many of your names, but please feel free. Go ahead in the chat box and say briefly who you are and what brought you here today or where you're tuning in from. It'll give us a little bit of a sense of community in this online world. Speaking of the chat box, I will be putting in the chat box some of the links to articles and books that James and I are going to be discussing. And I just wanted to remind you that you will have a chance to interact with me and James. There'll be a time at the end of the webinar to ask questions. I do ask that you put your questions in the Q&A button, not in the chat box. That just makes it a little easier for us. So what I wanted to do now briefly was just tell you a little bit about Scala Foundation. So I started Scala in 2016, and the big purpose of Scala is to try to revitalize American culture by renewing liberal arts education and supporting a civilization of love. Part of the reason I'm so excited to have James Matthew Wilson here today is that a part of liberal arts education that Scala really deeply cares about has to do with literature and fiction and poetry, as well as creative nonfiction. And we'll get more into this today, but the talk we're having today really aligns with Scala's mission to restore meaning and purpose in American education by promoting classical liberal arts. Now, Scala does this by trying to spread the love of the liberal arts tradition to high schools and college and graduate students, people who go on to advocate for this tradition. We've done multiple summer seminars on philosophy of education. We're doing our 5th one this summer. And we also try to then share these ideas with influential decision makers in universities and in education more broadly to try to introduce the ideas we're talking about today into their curricula. And James also really fits with our objectives of trying to influence the cultural ecosystem that we all live in. Scala wants to work with professionals who create culture in arts and media and also people who work in government who care about culture and help them think about culture as part of the liberal arts tradition. And also think about how the liberal arts tradition is tied to the fundamental principles of freedom that undergird everything about the American system, but also how culture and beauty that we're going to talk about today brings back the nexus between truth and beauty and goodness. And I think these ideas are so important because not only have we seen really unprecedented political crisis in the recent years, I've also seen a lot of students struggling fundamentally with meaning and struggling with their own happiness, questions about what does it mean to really be happy. So by working with people like James, who are part of the cultural ecosystem, James is also an educational entrepreneur that Scala wants to partner with to help found new programs, which he shall tell us about in a moment. Scala tries to restore the liberal arts tradition, revitalize American culture, and build a civilization of love. Now, I want to also thank our co-sponsors today who are part of this ecosystem and these educational entrepreneurs. Those co-sponsors include the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, the McGrath Center at the McGrath Center for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, the Portsmouth Institute in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, the Providence College Humanities Program, and the University of St. Thomas, St. Paul Catholic Studies Program. So thank you all for your co-sponsorship. Thank you all for coming today. And without further ado, let me introduce our guest, James Matthew Wilson. Hello, James. How are you?
Hi, Margaret. I'm good. Great to be here.
Great. Well, I don't know how to introduce you other than what I already said. You're a philosopher and a poet and so much more. So I know that you're currently at Villanova University, but you will soon be leaving to direct a new program, a Master's of Fine Arts at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Now, I want you to tell our listeners about that program. But before we start, maybe you could share with us your biography. Before you became James Matthew Wilson, the poet and philosopher, could you tell us a little bit about your own personal and educational background that led you to love to do this work around the intersection of philosophy and poetry?
Sure. I don't know why, but popping into my mind this afternoon is an episode that happened many years ago. In fact, when I was probably in middle school, my brother was writing an essay on Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. And I just remember kind of sneaking into the room and standing over his shoulder, trying to read this essay and thinking this was the most important thing that he could possibly be doing. He was writing, I was reading the quotations from the play that he was putting into the essay and his discussion of it. And I just wanted to learn more and more. But of course, I was also a little brother standing over a big brother's shoulder when he was trying to do his homework. And so I got shooed away. And it was actually a good 12 years before I think I actually finally read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. But it was in that moment that I saw the way in which just the encounter with the language of poetry and the sense that it meant something, that there was a depth to it that had to be talked about, that just seemed like the most important thing that one could be doing. And so I've always thought of that as one of those decisive moments where I had never written anything really. I was just a little kid, but where I thought writing would be one of the great things that you could do with your life. I don't know why that moment's been on my mind so much lately. It keeps cropping up in memory. But I guess it goes a long way in explaining something that I'd also want to share, and that took place just a few years later. When I went to the University of Michigan as an undergraduate, precisely because they had a creative writing program with the distinguished Hopwood Awards program for writers. And I thought, this is the kind of place where I could find other writers, other people who want to write, and begin honing my own craft. And fairly early in those years, I found just those people. In fact, we sort of very judiciously assembled a small group of writers, and we started meeting weekly at my house to talk about our stories. And when I look back on those people with whom I spent so many hours in those early years, there are two things, and really only two things, that I think we all agreed on. We were very different people in most respects, but there were two things that we agreed on. The first was that craft mattered, that the purpose of art was to make something good. Art is making, and art is, as Jacques Maritain and other figures and Aristotle would point out to us, art is a practical virtue. So its good is found not in what it does to the person. Its virtue is not subjective. The virtue of art is realized in the thing made, in the object. So the sense of craft as mastery of the making of an object struck us as of fundamental importance. But it was not, as some people would say, an empty formalism. We believed that craft matters, that making a good work matters, but that the good work itself had a power that we could not explain, that we would not even bother trying to explain, and that it could change your life, that an encounter with a work of art was capable of affecting the one who experienced the encounter and changing that person's life. As a writer, those two ideas are perfectly sufficient. And as I've grown in the craft, and in fact, as I took what to some people might seem a rather unimportant leap, but to me was sort of life-changing in itself, took the leap from writing prose fiction into writing poetry almost 20 years ago, those two convictions really shaped my life and my way of thinking about how I wanted to live in the world and the world itself. But there is that side of me, I guess, that's just intrinsically inclined to philosophy. And so as I looked at those two principles, craft matters and an encounter with the work of art could change your life, I just, as the years went on, kept reflecting on them. And the result of that was not simply to think a little bit more deeply about the work of art, but rather it led me into metaphysics and the medieval doctrine of the transcendentals and beyond that, so that before long, I was trying to come to an understanding of just how the world was and how reality worked. And of course, probably inevitably, I hit upon the language of being and the language of beauty and the language of intellect. And so that led me to begin writing on the transcendentals and on metaphysics and the relationship between, I guess this is the best way to sum it up, the relationship between aesthetic form, the form of the work of art, and ontological form, the form that Plato and Aristotle tell us constitutes things in their reality.
Wow, that's fascinating. You know, you are now the third person I've talked to in the last week or two who has told me a story of falling in love with writing as a very young person. How old were you when you were looking over your brother's shoulder at Shakespeare?
I don't really know. I was probably 11. Yeah.
Literally, other people told me I was in the fourth grade,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a fourth grade teacher who taught us a play, and then we had a creative writing assignment. And it's fascinating to me that people recall these moments in their youth, in some ways before, you know, all the scientific knowledge has taken over, and they have this open imagination and this desire. And also, I thought it was interesting because I encountered you through your work on metaphysics of art. And I assumed that you were a philosopher. And when we had pancakes recently in Philadelphia, you told me you've never taken a philosophy class. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Well, I laugh because I love the philosophy that you write. And I have a secret to tell you that I think I've only taken one philosophy class in my life. And I don't have any formal classes in theology, though now I teach it. So sorry to my employer. But I mean, I'm mostly self-taught in philosophy and theology, as you are. But you came to the study of metaphysics and philosophy because of your passion for writing. And if I may say, because of your passion for writing as a craft and producing good writing, which led you to study you use these big words, ontology and metaphysics. Now, there's a lot packed in there, and don't worry, we're going to unpack it in the next hour and 15 minutes that we have left. Because what I heard you saying, and I want you to unpack this for us, is that writing is a craft, but it's a craft that combines beauty with truth, with intellect, with knowledge. It's not a craft for the sake of the craft. There's a product at the end of it that one looks at and makes a truth claim. It could be wrong, but it's making a truth claim, right? And I want us to talk about how this relates to an integral education in liberal arts and really the function of art and culture for personal happiness and for society. So let's go now to this point, maybe it'll just help our audience before we get into what you're proposing. If you don't mind me asking to spell out a little bit what you're critiquing, because my experience has been in talking with other writers, and if I'm not mistaken, the reason you're founding a new program in creative writing is precisely because modern creative writing and modern literature does not always take seriously philosophy, much less philosophy of metaphysics and being. So can you tell us a little bit about what I read so poignantly in your book, A Vision of the Soul, that you're critiquing some of these ideas about culture and beauty, where culture is simply transgression, not coherence or beauty, that beauty is self-expression and not what you said, transcendence, self-transcendence, and that the ultimate good is simply a private choice, not something that's revealed or truth that we discover. So how is what you're proposing different than the way most writing programs or creative writing programs think about philosophy?
Oh, that's a huge question, Margarita. You may have to repeat it for me to get out to get all the points down. I think we need to begin actually before we start talking about truth and beauty by talking about goodness. Our age is one that sees goods everywhere, but it can't conceive of any one good as having its own integrity, of things being good in themselves. So most people, when confronted with the question of the good, end up just by default answering it for themselves and for others in more or less utilitarian terms. Good gets reducible to a sentiment or a feeling in yourself. When we ask questions about society and our place within it and our pursuit of the good within society, we assume that the language of the common good is some kind of ruse to get us to do something we don't want to do, that the idea of intrinsic goods is simply unintelligible to us, and so we distrust them. And so we look for some kind of social utility to justify the existence of things. Well, that's a destructive way of thinking about goodness for everyone in every single circumstance. There are useful goods. There are some things that are only good because they enable you to attain some further good. But even those goods are only good insofar as we can arrive at an understanding of what's intrinsically good. For the arts, it's as great a disaster as is imaginable, but it's also been kind of a perennial problem in the arts. Here's what I mean by that. If you go back to the ancient world, we have Horace's, on the whole, invaluable Ars Poetica, where he gives us a definition of poetry's aim that has been sort of a theme played with various variations over the subsequent 2,000 years. And that is that poetry is to please and instruct. That is to say, its existence is justified first by its capacity to give you a subjective pleasure, but then also to teach you something about the objective world, usually about moral goodness that stands outside of you. Horace's definition, I think everybody agrees, has much to say for it, and it's very helpful. But it's also an early indication that it's hard for us to envision things as good in themselves. Now, when art gets called good in itself in our day, just the opposite of what Horace says ends up getting affirmed, and that is a kind of decadent aestheticism that says, well, it doesn't have to have anything to do with truth. It doesn't even have to be pleasurable. It just has to have beauty to it. But that's actually an impoverished definition ends up being an impoverished definition of the beautiful. What we need to discover is that things finally are justified in terms of their goodness, including their own intrinsic goodness. We need to recover a sense of the intrinsic good. And when we look at art and literature, we need to recognize that the fine arts are a species of intrinsic good that, like all intrinsic goods, tends to sort of radiate beyond itself. Now, what does that mean? It radiates beyond itself. Well, to speak of intrinsic goods, especially about we have to know something about the human person. Human beings are made for knowing. We're intellectual beings, intellectual animals. The classic term is to call us rational animals, and that's probably the preferable term on balance, but intellectual animals gets at something very important. It gets at the way in which our minds, which go out of themselves through the senses, go out into the world through the senses, and gather things to themselves initially for our own survival and for our own practical use. Those same minds find fulfillment only when they stare at things that are good for their own sake. And that act of staring at the intrinsically good is what we call contemplation. So to call us intellectual animals means that we are the animals that were made for contemplation, to see what is intrinsically good and dwell within it, not to go beyond it, but to dwell within it. Human life then becomes a kind of ladder of ascent, where we go from contemplating intrinsic goods that are lesser to intrinsic goods that are higher, until it culminates in the one act of contemplation that is absolutely inexhaustible, and that is in fact our true destiny, and that's the contemplation of the light of God. So, well, look what just happened. We went from talking about Julius Caesar to talking about the contemplation of God. I knew there was going to be a lot in that answer, and there's more too, but I think I'll throw things back to you.
No, that was fantastic. I will say that I pulled out a quote from your book where you say this as well, right? That part of the reason I think we're talking about this today, the intersection of beauty and truth and goodness, is because on the first glance, like, beauty is subjective. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Most people, oh yeah, okay, sure. That's, yeah, of course, you think something's beautiful, I don't. Da, da, da. But you're saying, hold on. Like, that's actually a pretty profound statement to say that beauty is subjective, because what beauty is supposed to do is to lead us to a deeper truth, to open us up to a receptivity to the fullness of the truth, which is why beauty is so important for truth and for happiness. And what you're saying, you say it really clearly in your book on page 62, your book, A Vision of the Soul. We have to climb up ladders of truth, goodness, and beauty until we encounter these things, not in things, but in and as themselves, right? So when you were giving the example of yourself as a child, fourth grader or something, falling in love with literature, children at that age know how to love things in and of themselves. And I think what education does too often is tell us to treat everything as purely subjective for our pleasure, which you mentioned, or purely utilitarian because it's going to get us something else. And you're saying, no, wait, hold on. There's a very different understanding of beauty that we have forgotten. So I don't know if this would be a good time to bring in von Balthasar, who I know has been a good influence on you to explain this.
That's exactly what I wanted to do, actually. I wanted to revisit your question from a slightly different angle by way of introducing von Balthasar. I said that it's disastrous for human beings in general, and for artists in particular, to have a problem with goodness, to be incapable of recognizing things as intrinsically good. I think what we're seeing in our day is the unfolding of, at both the level of a political movement and of an advanced state of social decay, of what comes of not being capable of affirming things as intrinsically good. For the artist, if you don't believe that the work of art has any kind of intrinsic goodness to it, then like a somewhat boulderized forest, you're always going to be looking beyond the artwork to see what utility it can attain. The effect of that is that we come to think of the arts as mere vehicles of political action, that by making this thing, you're somehow going to effect some kind of particular change in society. Well, that vulgarizes the purpose of art, and it boulderizes the quality of art. It vitiates the claim that art can change your life just in virtue of itself, because it requires that your attention to craft be subordinated to the art's political utility. The artist becomes, in the words of Aldous Huxley, a propaganda engineer. The propaganda engineers of the Brave New World also appreciated Shakespeare. They just couldn't understand how Shakespeare could be intrinsically beautiful. This is unsurprising that the failure to think about intrinsic goods should be of such consequence. But in fact, when we begin to think about goods as being intrinsic, we cannot help but begin to talk about beauty. And that's where von Balthasar becomes so helpful. I've shared with you today the sort of biographical origins of my work as a writer, as a poet, and as a philosopher. Intellectually, I think the genesis moment, the germinal moment that has just been bearing fruit for years and years and years in my life was an encounter with just 2 pages at the very beginning of Hans Urs von Balthasar, the theologian's book, The Glory of the Lord. In the second page of the book, he says the following: "We can be sure that whoever sneers at the name of beauty as if she were an ornament of a bourgeois past, whether he admits it or not, can no longer pray, and soon will no longer be able to love." And he continues, "Without beauty, or at least in an age where we can no longer see beauty and reckon with it, no longer take it seriously, in such a world, the good loses all attractiveness. The self-evidence of why it must be carried out is rendered invisible." And he continues, "In a world that no longer has confidence in beauty, the proofs of the truth lose their cogency. Syllogisms may still dutifully clatter away like rotary presses or computers, which spew out exact numbers. But the logic of these answers is itself a mechanism which no longer captivates anyone." And then finally, he says, "In a world without beauty, or where we can no longer see beauty, what becomes of being, which Thomas Aquinas calls a sure light for reality? All of these things," says von Balthasar, "will be lost. Prayer and love, but also the self-evidence of the good, the captivation of the true, the light of being. These things too are eclipsed in a world that denies the reality of beauty." I do think I've spent much of the last 20 years trying to reckon with those sentences, because their meaning is not at all self-evident. Why should this be the case? Well, to explain it, we actually have to think back to the medieval concept of the transcendentals. There's considerable controversy as to whether beauty should be included among those transcendentals, but for those of us who don't know what transcendentals are, it doesn't make any difference anyhow. But I think we're going to affirm that it is one. Here's what the doctrine of the transcendentals was for the medieval philosophers. Aristotle had said that being is what constitutes things as real. But since there are many different kinds of things, all beings generally fit into one or more of 10 categories: place, substance, accident. It goes on for a while. I'm not going to detain us on that one. But what, asked the medievals, what can we say about being itself? Not in any particular category, but is there anything to be said about being as such? Is there anything that is inherent to just being, existence itself? And the conclusion was, well, if something's a being, it must be one. And everything that's real is a thing. So thingness is a transcendental property of being. Doesn't matter what kind of being, everything's a thing. And we affirm that all the time. People say things like, "Oh, that's a thing now." That's our daily affirmation that we too are scholastic philosophers. But then things get a little bit more complicated after we go beyond oneness and thingness. When John Wayne in The Quiet Man sees Maureen O'Hara coming down with her sheep from the side of the hill in the Irish countryside, the first thing he says to Micheline Og Flynn, his leprechaun friend, is that real? What he means by is, I'm seeing this, but is it true? Does it have being? Those two separate questions, they can be asked with different language, nonetheless speak to one reality. When we say that something is, that it's a thing, that it's real, we're also affirming that it's true. So truth is intrinsic to being. And then we look at all the beings and we see that everything that exists is simultaneously the outcome of some intentional process. That is to say, something purposively led to the coming into being of this particular thing. But then when that thing came into being, it too moves beyond itself, diffuses itself, gives itself away in producing something else. So a mother and father come together in marriage to give birth and life to a child. The child is the end of their marriage, the purpose of their marriage. But we don't say, look, the child exists, now it's done. No, the child itself then is set out on a path, a telos, a purpose, to become more fully itself, to grow, to flourish, to add to its perfection, and then eventually to attain happiness in life. And so we see that goodness, that is to say, some purposive aim at which things are targeted. Goodness itself is intrinsic to reality. It's present in everything insofar as it is a thing. Well, most of us are tempted to stop there. Human beings know the world more or less in two ways: by desiring and by knowing with the mind, reason. So we say truth and goodness, that's enough. In fact, it's not enough. The reason that our minds can see being as true and can see being as desirable, as good, is because being itself has its own integrity to it. As Thomas Aquinas said, it has its own light. Another word for light would be splendor. Beauty is nothing other than the capacity of being as such to disclose itself as having form. That's not reducible to the truth, because it's not merely saying I'm here to be known, though it's saying that. It's saying I'm here, I'm real, I'm one, I'm desirable, and I'm capable of giving myself away in myriad different ways. Who's this I I'm talking about? Everything that exists. So we reached kind of two conclusions. Beauty as a property of being, beauty as threaded into reality, beauty as intrinsic to everything that is not a nice, fanciful supposition. It's actually the ground on which truth, goodness, and being them itself find their kind of justification. How? Beauty is the way in which these things disclose themselves as having a reality unto themselves. All right, we know this morally, because if you do something good, something heroic, something noble, and someone questions you, why did you help that little old lady cross the road? Or why did you go off and fight in the Second World War? This would probably not be the language that rushes to mind in those particular instances, at least not the same way that it might be when we put icing on a cake. But finally, the answer we'd have to give is for the beauty of it. That is to say that when we do something intrinsically good, we suggest that there's a kind of radiance beyond that goodness that is self-evident and self-justifying. And that's that generosity of being that we call beauty. How does this relate to poetry? Well, that was not even part of the question, was it? But I think it's part of the question for me, because that's how I got started thinking about it.
Before we get to poetry, can I make a link here between what you're saying and what got me interested in this? There are a lot of pieces of my background that people don't know, but before I did a PhD in sociology, I actually worked for 3 years at the Aristotle Foundation for Peace and Human Progress in Central America. But I was visiting battlefields of former combatants in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala in the mid-1990s. And what got me interested in beauty was this question of how do you restore society after civil war, after violence? And I actually have a creative writing piece coming out on my time in Nicaragua. It's going to be coming out in Plow magazine, where I reflect on a visit to a zone with ex-Contras, one of whom was named the Jackal, and just the cycle of violence. But I also saw some beauty there. And then later, speaking of poetry, I did my first book, my dissertation in sociology, and then my first book was actually about Haiti. And Haiti is not a primarily written culture. It's an oral culture and a pictorial culture. And actually there's a saying in Haitian Creole that says, analphabète pas bête. That means being illiterate doesn't mean you're stupid. And Haitian Creole, they speak like that. They speak in images. So when I was in Haiti, which is also, as people know, a very poor country, I encountered an incredible sense of beauty. So what you said with your von Balthasar quote, that a world without beauty is a world without love, right? Is a world really without hope. Despite the material poverty in Haiti, I encountered hope and I encountered love because people know how to craft beauty in speech and in painting and in song and in liturgy. And it actually made me wonder what's been lost in the United States. What have we given up to a kind of rationalistic, or as you called it, utilitarian philosophy of the human person, where we might have material advancements that other countries don't have, but we have a kind of soul-crushing spiritual impoverishment in many ways that I think is related to a misunderstanding about beauty. Whereas in Haiti, they may not use the word, this is a transcendental property of being, and I'm creating a form upon which I reflect that deepens my da-da-da, but they do it intuitively. Maybe because it's not been beaten out of them. And maybe in this country, we don't know how to educate this creative intuition that people have. So that was kind of the link that I wanted to make, because you made these points, which you also make in your book, that, you know, beauty is the appearance of beings that opens into the depths of being with a capital P, right? That opens us up to the ultimate transcendental, which is God, right? You also made these points that human happiness consists in this intersection of truth and goodness and beauty. And so I know you've got more to say on that, but all of what you said goes into, which I'm sure you'll talk about now with regards to poetry, but also your 6 great insights that you talk about in your book, that we're an intellectual animal, that you said that, well, I will let you, fill that out, that the world itself is created and ordered to beauty. And again, I want our listeners to realize that these are not abstract concepts. You're talking about poetry as a craft. I'm talking about what I saw in Haiti: music making, liturgy, painting, craft, beauty that's intrinsic to our life in common and to our personal happiness.
I'm reminded by your comments of an experience I had when I lived in Boston many years ago, which was there were a great number of Haitian Creoles where I lived, and so I'd come across their newspapers and their magazines. And I've always, I've long, I should say, spoken French and read French, and there was such an excitement to pick up those magazines and to see totally unfamiliar spelling that made no sense to me when my eyes first fell upon the letters on the page. But then as soon as I pronounced the letters the way I would in English, I then would hear French rising from the page. And so what seemed initially unfamiliar was in fact deeply familiar. This is a typical instance of what it means to encounter or perceive beauty. One of the glories of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, is that an encounter with beauty is supposed to remind us of our vision of the splendor of truth, the form and splendor, the vision of the forms in the eternal place of being that Plato describes in that dialogue. And I always like to say to people, what that means then is the layman's definition of beauty is, I think I've seen you someplace here before. I think I've seen you around here before. Why should that be the case? Especially for those of us who don't believe that our souls have fallen into the body and are straining to grow wings to go back up to the place of being, as Plato says they are. Well, for us too, we recognize that an encounter with form, with the way in which being discloses itself as having a form to give itself away, to be known, to be desired, merely to be perceived. That what happens there is we're experiencing the world as intelligible mystery. It's already somehow familiar to us. And so as we encounter a truth, we just place that truth into a broader sense of the cosmos, of an orderly reality. And then we also sense that when we encounter some particular thing, we can enter through its contemplation into a contemplation of that broader order. And so it's the role of the arts in particular, and whether visual or literary or otherwise, is that with the particular attention to artistic form that says, we're going to make this good in itself, the artist effectively draws attention to the formedness of the thing in itself. By drawing attention to its form, he leads the eye of the mind through this particular formed thing into a deeper encounter with mystery. That is, a deeper encounter with the fact that there's something rather than nothing, that things are formed, that things are and they are intelligible, that things are and they are desirable, that things are and they have their own existence, and yet they're always and already part of something bigger and greater than themselves. They don't exist merely in themselves, but always in relation. This is the experience of beauty. And it's at once the first experience we ever have. As von Balthasar mentions, it's given to us as early as when, as infants, we look up in the face of our mother and have become capable for the first time ever of smiling in response to her smile. So it's primary, it's primeval, and primordial beauty is. But beauty is also ultimate. We sense the finality of beauty, that it's the last light that's inexhaustible at the limits of all knowledge and all desiring, and that finally justifies those things, as von Balthasar said. So in trying to think through the way in which beauty is both first and last, primordial and ultimate, I tried to just entirely rethink what it is our tradition has taught us, which I call the Christian Platonist tradition, and what it means to be human. And I came up with 6 I call basic insights. And these are not in any way original thoughts of my own. In fact, to the contrary, the point was to list out those basic things that all of us already know, even if we're not so sure we believe them, and to think consciously about them. And so these are what I call the 6 insights of the Christian Platonist tradition. I'm just gonna have to read them for you. They're fairly short. The first one is one I mentioned earlier, that man's an intellectual animal. The second is that, as such, man's nature is founded on a prior or foundational intelligibility in the world, and that he is intellectually and erotically oriented toward a transcendent knowledge of that reality. The third insight is that this dual orientation proceeds by way of reason towards an intellectual vision that's perceptive of beauty itself, with a capital B, which is the splendor of truth. The fourth is that the world as a whole and in itself is ordered by and to beauty. The fifth, that human dignity specifically consists in our capacity to perceive and contemplate that splendorous order. And thus the most excellent form of human life is that which is given over to such contemplation. And then finally, the sixth insight is this. This contemplation realizes itself in what we may call happiness or salvation, and is characterized by an activity that resembles passivity. That is to say, it's not simply the absence of motion, but a fullness of activity that we may call peace and freedom.
Thank you. Okay, we could go on with those 6 points for quite a long time. I was able to put them into the chat box, but I don't want to cut people short. I want people to go to your website, which I've also linked to, and read more about this to get this book. But I think if I could, it's impossible to boil down what you're saying to 1 or 2 concepts, but you use the term Christian Platonism, which I want to come back to. But you also said something about the fundamental nature of who we are as human beings and why beauty is the splendor of form. And you use the word beauty helps us see our participation in reality and our relationship to other objects in reality. And I just can't emphasize how important that is, because thinking about the nature of what it means to be human as fundamentally participatory means what I was getting at before, that beauty offers us a way of self-transcendence, rather than the ultimate truth and ultimate reality being somehow out there that we can speculate about, but never attain, or somehow completely contained within us. And if I just dig deeper inside of myself, I'm going to come to ultimate truth. Both of those are misleading, I'd say. What you're saying is that beauty helps us participate in a truth that's bigger than us. And it's actually when we are participating that we experience joy and in some ways experience the true meaning of freedom. Would you say?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So a number of years ago, I published an essay called, actually more recently than a number of years ago, but I think it was called Emptying the Tankard, Recovering the Soul in the Age of Self. I was just talking with David Devil and Liz Kelly at Logos, the Journal for Catholic Studies, about this on their podcast a week or two ago. One of the first things one realizes in looking at the first great philosopher of the soul, Plato, is that there's nothing very personal about the soul. We modern people tend to think of ourselves as to use the language of Charles Taylor and actually Carl Trueman, whose book I just reviewed this last week for the genealogies of modernity. We tend to think of ourselves, well, first of all, as selves, and of ourselves as expressive individuals. So the purpose of human life is to be true to yourself, to find your true self, and to actualize or realize that self, that what's intrinsic to you. This seems to be the one place where we envision something as intrinsically good, ourselves. The thing is that it carries with it the notion that anything that comes from outside of you is heteronomous, is something inauthentic that needs to be purged away so that you can actualize yourself. You don't want to conform to society. It's all social constructs anyhow. You need to actualize yourself. Well, the thing is, we're so intrinsically social that there's really not a whole lot left to us if you take away the social, if you just debar it or rule it as heteronomy or some kind of social construct or something artificial. We're naturally social, so that leads us to pretty much reducing ourselves to a few twitches of nerves in the body whose feelings are to be realized. That's what Charles Taylor means by expressive individualism. If we look back to Plato, again, as sort of the founding father of the soul, which is not quite right, but it'll do for now. He tells us something altogether different. When you realize that you can know things, which you have done just the moment you realize that you can know things, you realize that you are by nature intellectual. And the intellect has as its particular capacity the power to participate in the being of another. Aristotle tells us that it's by words that the contents of one mind can be shared with another. And he tells us elsewhere that the mind is in a certain sense all things. What he means is that to know is to enter into, or to use kind of Platonic and scholastic language, to virtually participate in the being of another. To be marked with a soul, therefore, is not to be marked as having some kind of immortal integrity to yourself that you just need to protect and guard and keep safe, and all will be well. You'll be actualized. It's rather to be marked as one who has the capacity to go out of himself and to enter into the life of other things. We are naturally born for communion and community, and that does not limit itself at the communion and community we have with other human beings. We're really born for communion and community with the whole of being, everything that has form.
Thank you. Look, I want to remind people that we're going to move to the Q&A in a little bit. So please send some questions for James and I, really for James in the Q&A. And don't worry, if these ideas seem like you want time to chew on it and think about it, we are going to not only share this recording later on Scala's YouTube channel, where you can also find our previous recordings from the Love of Learning series, as well as our other talks on beauty with Sister Noella, aka the Cheese Nun, with Makoto Fujimura. So please check out Scala's YouTube channel for those videos. But I also just wanted to make a point that the goal of these interviews is to actually produce another book of dialogues about beauty. And in case you didn't know, I must take a little moment for an announcement. I just got the first copies of my book, The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts, which is going to be available for sale on June 15th. I got some advance copies from the publisher, Clooney Media. And this book is actually the transcription of talks like this, webinars like this that I did last year during the pandemic on questions around education. And this dialogue with James is a response to really the overwhelming interest people showed about integrating beauty back into education. So I decided that this topic needs a whole nother book. But let me just say that producing this book and these webinars doesn't happen without your support. So those of you listening today, please do consider supporting Scala. You can see a link to donate on our webpage. And I'm going to make a special offer that anyone who donates $100 to Scala between now and June 15th, when this book will be available for sale, doesn't have to buy it. I'll mail you a signed copy, but please, you need to support Scala for $100, get this book and help us really produce the next book out of this, so that we can get these ideas out. So look, so what I wanted to come back to now is why all of this matters so much for education and for human happiness. You gave us these 6 beautiful points. You were talking about poetry, and I wanted to just maybe then make this point linking back to another name that I'm surprised hasn't come up yet, Jacques Maritain, who you and I both also like to draw on. And he says, or you quote him as saying, I think summarizing a lot of what you said, that aesthetic education or education in beauty is an initiation into the perception of reality, right? What you were just describing so beautiful, how fundamental it is to our human nature to participate in something bigger than us, and how all of our desires in some ways are oriented towards that. But if I may say, I think we live in a time where those desires are fragmented. And people don't know what is the bigger thing that they want to participate in. And I know that you have a particular understanding of our title, Art is a Jealous God, the necessity of beauty for human happiness. But let me just say why I picked that title. Out of all the things you've published, I saw this title. And it may not be what you had in mind. But when I picked the title, Art is a Jealous God, one of my concerns is that this desire for beauty, for things bigger than ourselves, is actually being warped by the wrong kinds of images or the wrong kinds of stories that don't ennoble us, images that don't ennoble the human body. And I think a lot of people feel captive to forms of beauty that are really dehumanizing entertainment. Now, I'm doing nothing here other than perhaps paraphrasing The Medium is the Message, Marshall McLuhan, later, oh my gosh, whose book am I forgetting the title of right now? You know what I mean, but amusing ourselves to death, right? When I first started doing seminars on philosophy of education, I was astounded at how much people wanted to talk about Neil Postman's amusing ourselves to death, that there's something pernicious about the way we look at images on social media and are competitive with people, with the way the human body is depicted in a utilitarian fashion. And when I say art is a jealous God, what I mean by that to me is that if we're not conscious of the images and the stories and the paintings and the pictures we're looking at, if we're not consciously choosing them, they're shaping us, whether we like it or not. And so the subcolon, the necessity of beauty for human happiness, is saying, maybe we should recover this tradition of art and beauty and truth and goodness that you're talking about, because there's a lot at stake if we don't.
If we don't believe in beauty, then those occasions where we typically expect to encounter the beautiful, as in the case of the fine arts, and even the practical arts when it comes to architecture, we're going to be insecure, and our insecurity will mislead us in bad directions. So for instance, I mentioned earlier, the doubt about the intrinsic goodness of literature leads many contemporaries to feel the need to thematize politics so that they can predict some kind of moral or political change to be affected by the work. So they subordinate the intrinsic goodness of the work, its form, to this extrinsic further cause down the road. We do it also to a lesser extent, for the most part, when we prioritize, as Horace does, pleasure. That's how we account for a lot of the arts of mass culture, of course, is that they're sufficiently well formed that they're capable of giving pleasure, but they also tend to isolate us and turn us inward upon the pleasure they give us. And rather than ramify out with splendor towards the rest of being. And of course, the extreme case of that is the crisis of pornography that we're seeing in our culture. But there's still a third kind of way in which an encounter with beauty, and particularly the beauty of fine arts, can be warped. And that is a doubt in the intrinsic, again, I should say, a doubt in the intrinsic goodness of form to be revelatory and participatory. And that can lead to a kind of didacticism or misguided emphasis on devotion, trying to make works of art edifying and not by way of a kind of artificial injection of moral quality. That's not something that is would belong if the form is granted its own particular integrity. This is the crisis of our age, is that one doubt about beauty, obsessive politicization, gets answered by a kind of mere Epicurean decadence. No, beauty's for pleasure only, it's private rather than public. Or by a kind of zealous moralism. Yes, beauty has an end, art has an end outside of itself, but we want it to be a good moral end rather than a sound moral end rather than a perverse one. Well, that last instinct is certainly much better than the other two, but I still don't think it gets things completely right. If Aristotle and Plato are right, and I don't have any doubt that they are, well, let me add the other name you just mentioned, then Jacques Maritain is right. The great insight that Jacques Maritain brought to philosophy was he said there are two terms that matter: being and intellect. The reason those are the only two terms that matter is because being is the stuff of the real, and intellect is that which comes to participate in the real. When we grant the reality of intellect and the reality of being, we will just naturally also grant the reality of beauty. And we will trust that when something is well made, when it is being realized with its own formal integrity, that it will be capable of revealing to us, first of all, our initial participation in it, and through it, our encounter with the total order of things in which that little particular thing has now taken its place. This is the foundation stone of all education. You introduce young people to this good thing, that good thing. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, I don't know, William Faulkner's A Light in August, John Milton's Paradise Lost, even better than that, Plato's Meno, the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. You introduce young people to these things that in themselves matter. And as soon as students can become perceptive of the form of these things, how does Aristotle's argument all hold together? What's the totality that we're encountering in this book of the Ethics? As soon as the student becomes perceptive of this form, that form, and seeing it as having a goodness and integrity, and finally a beauty to itself, the student's already on the path of entering into reality more deeply. Now, The bankers among us want to say, yeah, but what's the outcome? What's going to happen from there? Well, there's no shortcut to reality. You have to, and there's no shortcut to human happiness either. In the Symposium, Socrates tells us that we climb up the ladder from the contemplation of one kind of beauty to another until we arrive at beauty itself, the eternal beauty. And then he says something marvelously beautiful. When we contemplate beauty itself, we become pregnant. We engender in beauty all kinds of new, good, beautiful, true things that then come into the world. Laws and ideas, poems and new buildings, even new life, the life of our children. All of these things, all of these good, fruitful things, they come about. We bring them about, not in lieu of contemplating the beautiful, but because we have seen beauty, contemplated it, responded to it, and lived differently in consequence. This is the keystone of all education, and it's also the key to happiness in human life. And I'll just say one more thing. It's also the foundation of a good politics.
Oh, just one more little thing there, James. Now, let me say, I do think it's time to transition into how does one do this in our contemporary culture? The questions that are coming in the Q&A are sort of like, yes, we're on board with you, James. How do we do this? I want to get there. Before we get there, I'll just add on the significance of this, because you mentioned Jacques Maritain, who of course was really primarily known for his political philosophy, but has a brilliant philosophy of art and creative intuition and poetic knowledge, which I've written about on my blog. I've written about in Church Life Journal, for Clooney Media, and a few other places. But I want to say that this view of reality, which I find so inspiring, and probably other people here do too, contrast with one thing that I think it's hard to be alive today and not have heard in the past year, which is this term critical theory. And without going into a lot of depth, I do want to say that one of the parts of your book that I enjoyed very much was your contrast between Jacques Maritain, who we just heard about, and Adorno, who most people probably listening today have not heard of, but who's famous for, being a part of the Frankfurt School, out of which grew critical theory. Mm-hmm. The point that you made so clearly there was that although Adorno has an appreciation for art and beauty and even for spirituality, ultimately his metaphysics or his ontology is one where critical theory leads us to discover conflict and to discover domination. And once you've revealed one source of domination, what happens next? Well, you find more, right? So if I understand critical theory correctly, or how I heard you describing critical theory, there's a concern that some aspects of understanding who we are as human beings are actually that we live in a dialectic of conflict, and that the only way to progress, so to speak, is through conflict. And the vision of Maritain's beauty and truth and goodness being united would not be in accord with that. That the ultimate basis of reality for Maritain is not conflict, it is beauty. And it is love. And so I think a lot of our education today has implicitly taken on, well, we need to care about political things. So we need to talk about difficult things that are conflictual. But in doing so, has adopted a framework of reality as being based in conflict, rather than there's a higher value, there's a higher source of love that's going to allow us to transcend the conflict that we can see with our eyes. Would you say, how would you characterize briefly the difference between Adorno and Maritain on beauty and truth?
Well, I agree with what you said. That's certainly not where I would start, because where I'd end up. When I first started writing about Adorno and Maritain, and I did it simultaneously, and they became part of the same book, it was because I wanted to show that the most cynical or jaded of social theories, Adorno's Frankfurt School, and the Neo-Thomism of Maritain, were in certain ways in accord with one another. They both actually see beauty as absolutely essential. For Adorno, he sees the encounter of beauty in a way that's very analogous to what we would find in Mariton's affirmation of beauty as the splendor of form. The difference is how Adorno accounts for that encounter with the splendor of form. He sees aesthetic form as the way in which the unassimilated and the cry and suffering of what's repressed and oppressed by society somehow makes itself visible for a moment before being smothered once more by social structures. Mm-hmm. And so beauty is real. Beauty is a disclosure of the suffering interior to political reality and repressed by it. Okay. So an encounter with beauty is the antithesis of transcendent. It's actually submarine. It's a burrowing down into what precedes the establishment of the order of modern administered society, as Adorno would put it. So he takes beauty very seriously. And in fact, he thinks it's really the only way you can encounter truth. It's just his concept of truth is deeply impoverished. It's empty. Truth is a kind of condition of empty freedom before the logic of capitalism, the logic of blah, 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 the logic of oppression gets started and can tamp us down. Well, Adorno's right that beauty is important, and he perceives some kind of version of splendor and form, which he ends up thinking out in terms of rationality and the repressed. That's too Freudian for him, but it's close enough for the moment. What he's not seeing is that, in fact, every encounter with beauty, every moment we recognize anything, and it does not have to be a work of fine arts, it doesn't even have to be a work of nature in all of its highest glory to be beautiful, it just has to be real. Every time we recognize the beauty of some being, we are actually transcending history, transcending culture, transcending fate and every determination of our life, and rising up beyond the world.
Right.
Every time we do it. For Adorno, it's going down before historical injustice, as it were, could paper over the earth, could pave over the earth. But Mariton's right. In fact, at every such instant, we become what John Paul II and Alistair McIntyre would call culture transcending beings. We rise up as if on wings beyond anything historical and conditioned. Now, our encounters with beautiful things are always historical. They're always conditioned. They're always cultural. They're always particular things that exist. But by bearing beauty within them, they remind us that everything we encounter in history is participating in something that transcends history. I was recently rereading Pope Francis's Laudato Si, and I noticed the central theme of that encyclical, one that should be unsurprising for any Catholic to write, is that for all of the apparent inexorability and determinism of historical processes, the seeming inevitability for Francis of a perpetual growth model of free market capitalism, for instance, that will run roughshod over the earth. For all of the apparent determinism of that, at several points, Francis says simply, an encounter with beauty, it lifts you right up. The ability to perceive form is the foundation for human freedom. You mentioned Mariton's politics, and his political writings are beautiful things indeed, and in fact, very important for us to continue to study. They are founded first in the principle of intellect and being, of the ability of the human mind to participate in form and to encounter the true, the good, and the beautiful threaded into being. Why is that so important? Because that's what makes us human. Any politics that's not founded on that principle will be an anti-human or an inhumane politics.
Well, thank you. Look, I'm going to move to questions from the audience now, but I will say that when I was reading your comparison of Adorno and Maritain, an image that came to my mind that could be helpful to readers to understand what you were saying is the term that the sociologist Max Weber used, that modern society was trapping us in an iron cage, that our rationality and the bureaucratic nature, the kind of disenchanted world that Weber saw coming, leaves people trapped in an iron cage. And so I think Adorno's understanding of beauty, as you described it, is trying to liberate, in a way, that internal desire to express itself and to create something beautiful. But what you're saying, and we'll move into the questions now, I promise, what you're saying is that Adorno can't get us out of the problem that he correctly identifies because he gets his metaphysics wrong, so to speak. And so we need to go to Maritain to integrate truth and beauty and goodness and come up with a political vision that's hopeful and not one that's purely critical or purely pointing to the dark. And our only hope is this moment where we can express ourselves. No. Maritain says, no, we can, from these experiences of the beauty and from this participation in reality, develop forms of political life that are more human and are more fulfilling. So let's turn to the practical now, because this is in the questions that are coming in, the two lines of questions, some are in the intellectual clarification, but let's start with some of the practical. How does one bring this vision of truth and beauty and goodness back into education? And could you answer that question with specific reference to your new Masters of Fine Arts program, but also with link to what I understand your vision is that this Master of Fine Arts program is also going to be a springboard to reach public school teachers, to reach people of faith who may be teaching in Catholic schools or not in Catholic schools. Like, if you have this vision of training writers, but also reaching the public, how are you going to do both of those things, James, in your new program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston?
Great. So I want to actually take us back to where we started, to childhood. The language of Weber is so fascinating, the idea of the modern age as being disenchanted. And it's certainly, in some sense, that's correct. But if what Pope Francis says is correct, it could never be completely so, could never be completely true. Certainly the public reason, as some people would call it, of our age is disenchanted and scientific and rationalistic and deeply, deeply impoverished, as the philosopher Iredell Jenkins once put it. But go back to childhood for a moment. Go back to the time that you were walking through the woods and came upon the edge of a pond, and you found there the stripped bones of a deer that's been devoured by coyote. That encounter, which is a kind of dark moment, is an encounter with mystery. Think of another instance, and I'm drawing these from a poem I published in my last book, but you're walking through on that same walk, and you come through a field and you come upon a stand of evergreens, and you step out of the open world of daylight and into the dark enclosed shade of that grove. In those two moments, and in a million other moments, we enter into this sensation of mystery, this sense that I'm not a great admirer of this term, but I do find it very helpful, where we recognize that mundane reality remains and will ever remain enchanted for us. It always bears within it the possibility of being more than an appearance. There's always a deeper mystery to it. And the mystery is not the unknown. I'm using the mystery in the sense that a Catholic uses it. A truth that is inexhaustibly deep. Well, that experience should be foundational for all of our thinking about education, about politics, and about human life. That the presence of appearances in the world is always the entrance into a deeper, but also a higher mystery. So what I'm hoping to do with our new Master of Fine Arts program is to help foster a generation of writers who recognize that the fine arts are one of those ways by which we encounter mystery, that we enter into both the intellectual and the spiritual, and as well as the emotional depth and heights of things through the fine arts. There are lots of fine arts programs in the country. not all of them, but most of them have been totally taken over by the spirit of critical theory that says nothing can justify itself unless it serves the revolution. You can be in favor of the revolution and still recognize that that's not right. Things are good in themselves. Fine arts are designed, are by their very nature, their telos, destined to manifest the form of beauty. Anything else is extrinsic, extraneous, and destructive. So what we're hoping to do is to foster a generation of writers. And since it will be primarily an online program, not exclusively, but primarily, we want to be able to help writers everywhere in the country and beyond the country. Sorry, my phone's ringing there. And then second of all, we want the MFA program to become the foundation stone for a broader public program of renewing Catholic culture in our country. Only the Catholic Church has held the line in insisting that the account of the human person, as to use Maritan's language, a creature designed to be fed on the transcendentals. Only the Catholic Church has insisted on holding open the gates to reality that make human life a participant in the fullness of things. And so we're going to try to both draw deeply from the Catholic tradition, which, as von Balthasar put it someplace, is the guardian of metaphysics in our time, again, because it holds open the gates to reality. And we're going to try to build up that culture to renew it so that both in Houston, where our program is headquartered, and in the country as a whole, as our programs grow, that we will be making available to the general public all kinds of opportunities to enter into the intellectual life, the life of the fine arts, the life of a culture that, again, is nourished on the transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty.
Well, that sounds like an amazing program. So I want to encourage people to check it out. The MFA program is accepting applicants right now, and the program will be growing, both in terms of its for-credit, accredited programs, but also in its public outreach. And precisely, you're doing the work you're doing, and I'm doing the work I'm doing to try to respond to questions like the one I'm getting now from a teacher in a charter school system saying, I love this vision, but how do I do it? And I get those questions a lot. And what I would say, although we haven't talked about him today yet, I would also mention Roger Scruton as a great voice in this. And he approaches questions about beauty and truth, not always starting from the metaphysical or the Christian, but certainly compatible with it. So when I taught on aesthetics, I actually started with Scruton as a general overview of why this matters for culture and tradition more broadly. And then I bridged into the metaphysics. So I would encourage those of you who are interested in this, but aren't in an explicitly Christian context, to also look up Roger Scruton. But in terms of a practical implication of this, as I've already mentioned, I care about reintegrating beauty and literature and poetry and fine arts into education because I care about educating the whole student. And really, if we don't do that, we're only going to end up with students who are more addicted to video games and pornography and suffering mentally. So I think for administrators who are running schools and developing curriculum, we have to think about the consequences of the kinds of activities and experiences that students get. And what's the consequence of students not being exposed to beauty and fine arts? I've seen in my programs that students report that when they have nature or fine arts or craft or time to write a story integrated into their education, it integrates their psychology and their soul. And that has a lasting effect. As you said, you don't build culture overnight. You don't build a whole human person overnight, but there's a consequence to focusing simply on test taking or critical thinking skills and not introducing students to all of reality, including the contemplative dimension. This is part of Scala's mission, is to help educators. So I understand that many educators feel isolated right now, but please stick with us because we are trying to do this.
The origin of my book, The Vision of the Soul, was the aftermath of the 2008 election, where it was clear that that so-called conservative politics in America had failed because it was merely a politics. It had obsessed over electoral victories and done very little to preserve, foster or deepen our culture. And so I wanted, first of all, to outline what is that culture and what it would look like to deepen it. But among the chapters in the Vision of Soul are addresses I gave at classical charter schools, including the Great Hearts Academies in Arizona. And when I gave those lectures, I saw it as my task not to teach anybody anything new, but merely to remind both the teachers and the students at those academies of what we hold in common, to remind them of the great inheritance and gift that we have been given from our ancestors who have produced works of beauty, who have reflected on what it means to be human, and who have that wisdom to share with us now. And that wisdom is as available to us today as it has ever been and ever could be, because we are not historically determined creatures, we're historically transcending ones.
Well, thank you, James. And maybe also by way of answering another question from a participant, also along these lines, how do we do this when several people have actually commented in their questions like, it doesn't seem to me that my students care. It doesn't seem to me that my students are listening. So on a really practical position, how do you teach students who may not already agree with what you're saying? Can you capture the attention of students who aren't already taught to care about this?
Yes. Yeah. If I think it's false that the world is disenchanted, wonder, which is the foundation of all of the intellectual life, wonder has certainly suffered a setback in the last century or two. I have spent, in my former position at Villanova, spent the last 12 years, at least as part of my duties, trying to initiate students who have run the gauntlet through elite high schools and who really have therefore come to be exhausted by and even feel a certain repellence towards inquiry and education. That's what happens with modern schooling. To somehow be rekindled for a capacity for wonder. And I have two basic principles. One is, three basic principles. One is that with young people, you have succeeded the moment you've convinced them that thinking about ideas is just something worth doing. Being thoughtful is not a waste of time. Second, the way to do that first is not only by way of stories, because stories are easy to understand, but by way of stories because human happiness is about becoming fully formed. And human life, when it's fully formed, unfolds like a story. A number of years ago, I spoke with a sociologist who had been doing oral histories with people and trying to see if people saw their lives as stories. And to his dismay, most of them saw their lives as a mere flat chronicle, one darn thing after another, without shape, without form, without chapters to it. That's a sign of serious unhappiness. And clinical studies show that as much as my philosophical eye does. So we need to introduce young people to stories precisely because they need to learn how to form their own life story if they're going to be happy, if they're going to live fully formed human lives. But then my third sort of practical principle is as follows. Whether you think the world is disenchanted or not, it's really helpful to show students how the popular assumptions of our day make it seem disenchanted. So the kids just came home from kindergarten. So one of my chief aims is to take my students through the disenchanted world. And I usually begin with King Lear and then Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. I think Hobbes' Leviathan pretty much outlines the fundamental principles of public reason in our day. And so to study those principles, to study those ideas, to have the students actually have an opportunity to think about them in the abstract, as opposed to just living them as they already are in their Catholic high school in New Jersey or wherever, that actually will reveal to them, Joseph Conrad style, the horror of what we've made of our world and of ourselves. And when we recoil in horror, we look for someplace else to go, and that's when it's time to introduce something genuinely beautiful.
Well, listen, I hear your children in the background and we're almost out of time, but let me just kind of wrap up a few ideas and questions here. And also just to point perhaps a hopeful, practical way of doing this. You mentioned about teaching in your classroom, teaching stories. Listen, one of our listeners today who actually works for Scala, Bill Gonch, he teaches poetry online to people who are incarcerated. A friend of mine at the University of Michigan runs the Prison Creative Arts program, where they teach literature and creative arts. And they're not having prisoners tell their stories about what got them into prison. They're having prisoners do what you just said, create beautiful objects. And in doing that, it reconnects to them, to their humanity. So for our young generation who cares a lot about social issues, there are educational programs that take the fine arts into the oppressed and actually help them reconnect with their humanity, which is what I saw naturally happening in Haiti, right? So we can help connect students' desires for justice and help them see that actually, well, fine arts helps justice, not because it has to be about a political cause per se, but simply because fine arts and poetry helps us get in touch with our humanity. And that's what makes it just, or part of a just, good political system. So I think that there are, the last kind of questions I would end with, and I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions, but this is an important question, especially, someone wants to know where is God in this? You've talked about God a lot, but how important is it to lead with our need for God, right? And if our existence is owed to God, right? And if God is our final end, and if this is so integral, why not lead with that we need God, and then go into the intelligibility of being, and talk about appreciation of truth, goodness, and beauty. So I'm paraphrasing a question here, but I'm sure you've heard this question before.
Actually, it never occurred to me that you would have to choose between those two things. I think it's the case that in Jacques Maritain art scholasticism, for instance, that he proposes to artists that by encountering the beauty of being here, they're encountering the divine beauty, and through God's grace, they need only take that next leap from God as beauty itself to God as Jesus Christ. And so he follows Plato in thinking primarily in terms of an ascent up the ladder from being here to being as God itself. And that's intrinsic to the nature of beauty, because beauty is sometimes described through Thomas Aquinas in terms of integrity, proportion, and clarity, and sometimes described merely in terms of form and splendor. In fact, integrity, proportion, and clarity are merely Aquinas's way of explaining how form and splendor works. We encounter the form of something beautiful in recognizing its integrity, that it has a reality or wholeness proper to itself. But we also recognize simultaneously that nothing exists by itself. Everything has being. It's not being itself. Only God is being itself. And so it is natural, and in fact, it's intrinsic. This is the splendor of beauty in itself, that we move from the form into the mystery of its being, that is its splendor. That is to say, the way in its own existence, it's radiating forth from God, who is light itself, who is the divine light. Can we begin with God? Absolutely. The modern existential storytelling that we find, its earliest instance, perhaps in the modern context, is in Pascal's Pensée, though its antecedent would be Augustine's Confessions, and its sort of typical modern expression would be something like Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood or the novels of Graham Greene. In all of those cases, what we find are human beings who are born hungering for the absolute before they know what they're hungering for. And this is the existential condition. This is the human condition. As Augustine puts it, first we are, then we desire, and then we know. And it's the vexing thing about human life is that we don't know what we desire. We just know we desire it. We want what is good, but we don't know what the good is. That's how we're born. So in some cases, it would not be productive to say, well, you know, that good you're looking for, it's God right away. You need to, in some cases, it's important to initiate people incrementally into the mystery of being so that they finally realize that it culminates in God as being itself. But for other people, it might be equally as fruitful to just lead off by saying what I think is patently true. We're religious beings, and the great problem that besets us epistemologically is that we recognize the immediacy and the importance of the material world, this world in which we're living, and yet we sense that that's only important because there's something that transcends it. And Christianity has answered that vexing problem very simply with the person of Christ. And so there's no, since I think that condition of being vexed is intrinsic to every human being, it is not at all unthinkable to simply lead with the incarnate God who made all things and is the source of all things and is one of us and walks with us. I think that has worked for millions and millions of people to bring them to a richer and fuller understanding of themselves, of reality, and finally to salvation.
Well, James, that's a beautiful point to end on. And I am so sorry that we have to end. I do know that you have 5 children and a lot of boxes because you'll be pretty soon on your way for your move. So I just want to wrap up by way of answering some of the questions that have also come in from Henry, who works with me here at Scala as well. Like, what groups in society are doing this beauty well? Well, Henry, let me answer your question by thanking our co-sponsors. Well, first of all, let me thank Scala and its benefactors who believe in this mission of the unity of beauty, truth, and goodness. And let me also once again remind our listeners that without your support, we wouldn't be able to do these webinars, much less with Henry's diligent work, turn our webinars into a book. So thank you, Henry, for transcribing, for editing all of these transcriptions and making this into a beautiful book. Anybody who donates $100 by June 15th to Scala gets a signed copy of it. And we're going to transcribe this one as well. So be on the lookout for that. But our co-sponsors, I think, are also trying to bring this vision of beauty back into education. So thank you to the Portsmouth Institute for Faith and Culture. Thank you to the Providence Humanities Forum at Providence College. Thank you to the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame, which has a summer program for church leaders. So, and I know the Portsmouth Institute and Providence College also do outreach. The Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University, precisely inspired by Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, trying to build an ecosystem. And for me, cultural ecosystem is what we need. So we have institutions, Henry, but what Scala wants to try to do is bring those institutions together into an ecosystem. Don't want to forget to mention the other St. Thomas, University of St. Thomas and St. Paul Catholic Studies program. We had many of their students here with us today. They're doing beautiful work, pardon the pun, and they published Logos. So check out Logo magazine and the work of David Devil and Erica Kidd there. That's so amazing. And of course, the new program you're founding, James, the Masters of Fine Arts, you're going to be the leader of that. And I congratulate University of St. Thomas in Houston for taking that on. And it's so important right now to have these institutions to bring people together. One other group I'll mention, one person wrote in about Alice von Hildebrand. I'm sorry we didn't get into Hildebrand's ethics, but also his wife, Alice and Dietrich von Hildebrand, both wrote about art and aesthetics. Check out the Hildebrand Project. They do summer programs. But what I'm taking away from all of these questions is that we need more of this. We need more people, and we need more of a network of organizations and publications and examples of how to do this. So please check out Scala's YouTube interview, for example, with Jocelyn Jekyll at Martin Saints Classical School outside of Philadelphia about how she brings beauty into the classroom and how she uses literature as a form to teach science. She's actually a natural scientist, right? So looking at, science and nature and the importance of literature to teaching science. So Scala is trying to do this. And once again, I just want to say that really what we're hoping to do at Scala is to revitalize American culture, renew liberal arts education, Let's do a shout out now to anybody who wants to join this movement of writers doing this cultural creation. Please sign up for James' program. Please reach out to Scala. We're going to be doing some writers workshop as well, because we need to find people who are entrepreneurs, who are writers, to build this cultural ecosystem in order to achieve the vision that you're talking about. But I do believe, and I want to thank you, James, for giving us a clarity, a vision, integrity in that vision, and some proportion. And we need to keep up our hope and keep going. So thank you to everyone for being here today. Thank you so much for your time, James. Best of luck to you. Please, everyone, check out his amazing work and check out Scala's website for our book and many other forthcoming activities. Thank you, James, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Margarita. Have a nice day, everybody.